When you hear secularism, this is something I'll say tonight, you should just hear anti-Christian. There's no such thing as secularism. There's just a competing different religious establishment and regime that is asserting itself. And it's a liberal lie to think there's this kind of neutral secular, meaning religious-free, moral-free, bare kind of algorithm we all live in.
All right, thanks for joining me on this video. I'm here with my friend Timon Cline. We've done a few of these now. You're in town again. You're speaking at New St. Andrews College. You're doing all sorts of things now. Give me so for American Reformer, is it what's the official title for
Editor-in-Chief?
Editor-in-Chief at American Reformer. You're also give me the official title for Hale Institute.
Director of Scholarly Initiatives.
Director of Scholarly Initiatives. In my heart, you're the Lord Protector and always will be.
Lord Protector.
Lord Protector. That's another
my
title.
National title. Yeah.
And since I don't know what you're talking about. What are you talking about at Disputatio in just a moment?
Continuing the lecture series, this is 3 out of 4 for the year. We've been talking about law, the nature of law, and we're going to get into a bit on a religious establishment today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Oh, that should be dicey.
Yeah.
That should be fun. We should talk about the recent MSNBC. Let's launch from there.
Yes.
Heidi Presbola, I think her name was.
I don't know how to say it. Yeah.
She's for Politico.
She's a Politico reporter.
She said this wonderful thing,
Yeah.
She said the wonderful thing that these Christian nationalists are all about claiming their rights come from God.
Yep.
And I want to go quickly through. One, we obviously know that you can find clips of Joe Biden saying that our rights come from God. So what's happening in the Christian church, a lot of our Christian leaders are saying, hey, just because we say our rights come from God, don't call us Christian nationalists. And what they mean by that is, hey, just because we believe our rights come from God, don't think that we need any kind of Christian order to our society. Right?
Not like those people.
Not like those people.
Yeah.
And I think Heidi's shown us that, no, this is the time. Welcome to you're going to choose a side. You're going to be with no rights at all and no acknowledgement of God. Or if you're going to get your rights, if you're going to have real rights that don't come from the state, then you're going to have to pay some kind of acknowledgement to this Christian God. So I'm interested for you to game out. I know in your lecture on law, you basically said, look, originalism isn't enough. So why don't you start with that and just give us a quick word about what you meant with originalism isn't enough when it comes to law, and then I want you to press that in further to maybe the civil magistrates themselves.
Yeah. So when I talked about, and this would have been back in the fall, on originalism. I was springboarding from the Bostock decision, right, which essentially codifies transgenderism into our law in a certain way, and said that originalism isn't enough, that being the predominant mode of jurisprudence and interpretation conservatives have embraced for decades now. Justice Scalia, him and Justice Rehnquist, big proponents of it in their own way, but this was kind of stock and trade for conservatives for a long time. It's what it meant to be a constitutionalist. You're for the established order, you're for the history of your country, you're for how it's supposed to work. And so you're always kind of fighting against people who are trying to destroy that. What we've seen is that as a mode of positivism, meaning it's bare human law, there's really no appeal outside of the text when you're doing true textualism and originalism, is that's insufficient to hold our social order together and to give our law any kind of coherence. Right, so there's this clip we're talking about. I mean, ultimately, you should understand it foundationally as them saying there's no authority above or beyond what we are, the regime, the state, and all of its apparatus. There's nothing that we're accountable to, and there's no source of authority but ourselves, which is another way of saying we're gods. Right, so if we're the source of authority for our own rule and coercion, which all government does, and our own laws. The people who are appealing to anything outside of that are obviously a problem, and in many ways actually subversive. And this, as you mentioned with the civil magistrates, this should also be seen as a total corruption of that office, right? Because the civil magistrate, Christians have always maintained throughout the ages, receives his authority directly from God. We don't have to get into how certain structures of authority or governance might be organized. That's usually up to prudence, or whether, what the selection process is, how we pick who our magistrates are, whether they're ordained by God directly and we recognize them, whether we have some kind of voting power. That's neither here nor there. But the basic contention that survived all the way through the 18th century, which is when our founding is typically dated, is that there's something beyond this. We appeal to it both for the authority to pursue the good of the people. That's what government's supposed to do. Good according to what? That's the other question. And also that if there's any accountability for government, it has to come from beyond the government itself, back to its own authority, and that there's some kind of standard and understanding of the right operation of that authority that we hold it accountable to. So all of this in this clip was just a denial of Christian tradition. It's an anti-Christian. When you hear secularism, this is something I'll say tonight, you should just hear anti-Christian. There's no such thing as secularism. There's just a competing different religious establishment and regime that is asserting itself. And it's a liberal lie to think there's this kind of neutral, secular, meaning religious-free, moral-free, bare kind of algorithm we all live in. That's just not the way it works.
Yeah, and if you if you take an originalist, which sounds like the conservative thing to say, I'm an originalist. I don't believe it's this living document. I think we need to go with what they originally intended when they penned the words on the page. That sounds like a very conservative thing, but what Heidi's shown us is that you can be an originalist and totally agree with Heidi that your rights come from Big Brother. Your rights come from the state.
Or at least from what we've all decided we're going to accept, right? It's kind of up to us.
The human collective. And to draw that connection, because I think when people hear you say, well, originalism isn't enough, they're like, well, at least the conservatives that have just been steeped in secular thought, this anti-Christian thought, go, what's wrong with you? And they feel like you are you're opening up Pandora's box when you're claiming that there's no such thing as bad law. You said this once in my presence originally, which I thought was quite interesting. You have somebody says, hey, well, we have to deal with bad laws in the books, and so we have to kind of get along with these bad laws and try to put new laws in its place. And your response was, there's no such thing as a bad law. What do you mean?
Well, law doesn't derive from itself its own character or morality. So it's kind of like technology, right? There's no such thing as bad technology. There's just uses and abuses of technology, of the bare thing. Law, isn't self-referent. That's my point in saying that. And I often say, to be provocative, that basically the structure of things and way things are generally working is totally fine. It's actually operating the way it's supposed to. It's just that all the moral inputs are wrong. And so, the way that people want to bemoan, we're feeling coerced, we're feeling forced, we're feeling pressure to do X, Y, Z thing. And they're appealing to, they're sort of pulling up shy of where their appeal should really go. It's not wrong for the government to say, we endorse this kind of morality and not that kind. You are a good citizen if you do this and not that. That's what government always does. The problem is the type of morality and religion that's being proposed through that. That's where we should really take the fight. And that's what Christian nationalists in many ways are doing. It's not like it's a monolithic movement. And we can talk about the label, its use and utility in a minute. But people are waking up to, in some intuitive sense, this fact that it's not which but whether, and you got to make a choice on what kind of country you want to live in.
Okay, so let's talk about common law for a minute. We're here talking about law. You're saying, obviously, basically, in a nutshell, originalism doesn't work because you could have it without God, and originalism won't work because it's man left to his reason without any acknowledgement of the Creator and His particular revelation. Your human reason has to apprehend this revelation that God has granted us, and then therefore build human law upon that. When you hear common law, well, just give me a brief definition. Let's start with a brief definition of the common law.
Yeah, common law is the tradition that we consider ourselves to be in legally. Anglo-American common law, that's kind of this transatlantic kind of thing, but particular to England and its descendants, which of course America basically was. The idea in common law, which is usually separate doctrinally when you're considering it from not rigidly so, but don't think about statutes for a minute. Don't think about legislation. Think about the way that a controversy would arise between people in sort of a market setting or your husbandry or something. And you have particular ways of doing things that are established through custom and just dealing with each other over hundreds of years. This is the way, this is the side of road we drive on. Let's say there's no statute saying you have to do that. This is the way we do it. And then conflict arises, so you go before a mediator, before a judge, and the judge is supposed to decide according to, within this conflicting custom, according to general equity and general fairness, and of course the natural law, the higher law, which one's going to be best, and according to prudence as well. If, let's say there's no massive moral component to what's going on, it's just the side of the road you're going to drive on. And they decide what's going to be best, and from that emerges a sort of synthesis or new custom that's going to be authoritative, and you build upon precedent in a way, usually through analogy of what to make this all cohere. And so that's the way the English tradition of law, there's lots of other components to it, sort of emerged in this telling. And that's what we call the common law. It's sort of a ground up, human activity centric basis for your ways of dealing with each other, what's going to be authoritative. So that's the common law. And what the common law does is it always is accounting for the people that it is arising from and rules over. And so it's not like you can just plop it down amongst any people. It's very particular to this people, right, and their ways of life. And so when we did this in America, law was, you would see common law courts always taking notice of the predominant religion of the people that has to be respected and accounted for in the law, and in many ways integrated. So you have many cases noticing the common maxim from, usually attributed to Matthew Hale, that Christianity is part of the common law. And they'd say, why is that? It's because it's the religion of the people. This is part of our culture. And so these other things that are not, written on the page are part of this whole kind of life that is being expressed in the law and governed by it.
So that, inextricable connection between Christianity and the common law, like these go hand in glove. When did that begin to unravel? Like, just run us a little history in the American context.
Yeah, it's like anything, in hindsight it seems quick, but it's a slow burn. You had in the mid-19th century some courts beginning to challenge this. The first most noteworthy person to challenge it was Thomas Jefferson. No surprise there, I suppose. And said that this was a sort of ridiculous maxim that makes no sense. You had people like Joseph Story and others publicly refuting him, and it was not the consensus. His position was not the consensus. But you began to see as the country grew, became more diverse is probably part of it, but also in the legal profession itself, a move in jurisprudence towards a more scientific, policy-oriented way of judging, right? And it has no patience for religious or higher maxims that are unscientific and untraceable and unmeasurable and overall lack utility from their perspective. And so that around the same time you begin to see a sort of shunning of natural law being invoked by courts, and you also see the public life, the laws that touch public life, such as blasphemy and Sabbath laws, for instance, that express that Christianity and protect it, also to start being challenged and come off the books.
Do we have any, say you're editor-in-chief at American Reformer, that hits at a certain level, director of scholarly initiatives at Hale Institute, you're hitting at a pretty high level there in the academic world and the legal world with both your research and your networks. Break down how many people, say in the upper echelons, the people that have the know-how, the people that know the history, and maybe that are at all interested in forming public opinion on policy matters, should we go the common law. Break down that category of people along the lines of how many of them are at all open to the idea of common law, natural law, Christianly conceived, and how many are just in an absolute secular anti-Christian framework.
You're meaning in the country as a whole? Or
take our country.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, it's certainly a minority position, because even though the country is still numerically majority Christian, supermajority, it's over 60%. The extent to, a lot of people this is my theory at least, a lot of people, especially those Christians, we could say white evangelical voters, given their as a block and given their sort of power and reach, they want to be good Americans, of course, but they've been sold a certain bill of goods that tells them, this is what being a good American is. And so they've adopted that. You see this in a lot of our boomer friends, especially, sort of spouting off, tired liberal truisms about, their absolute kind of liberty over and against any kind of public coercion or standard for morality, and it's all about freedom, freedom, freedom. And so that's what they're in pursuit of. So anything that sort of can be packaged by the left as contributing to equality and freedom and all these sorts of things, they generally, or even if begrudgingly, will accept it, because it's always this logic of, well, it's what I'd want for myself. If not, I may not be a tranny, but I'd want the government to not tell me I can't castrate myself. I talk to people like this all the time. So that still, I think, is a very common sentiment that is ahistorical, untraditional, and I think misguided. I don't know at what point you would put a limit on that kind of rationale for what we're going to do publicly. But it seems like we may be arriving at a place where some people are at least beginning to see there has to be some stopgap. This can't go on in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so some sort of acknowledgement of our Creator, the triune God, and His revelation. I mentioned this to you several times, but in the Summa, Aquinas says that human law it's a rule or ordered, governed by a higher rule. It's a rule governed by a higher rule, and that rule involves both the divine law and the natural law, which I think puts all of the debate to rest. I think why don't we just stand with Aquinas and say that we need to both have legislators and judges who are paying attention to the Bible, that's divine law, and pay attention to natural law, man's participation in the eternal law. So but if you come out and say stuff like that, that's at least moving you into the realm of the establishment conversation, that you're at least beginning to say, oh, so you don't just want common sense judges. The common law just isn't about them kind of having two eyes in their heads and being able to make good calls. You're saying they actually need to be students of the book and students of natural law,
both
man's
books,
participation.
Book of Scripture and nature. Yeah,
that's sounding very Christian. It's very theocratic Christian nationalism. All of those kind of words come in. So we're having a lot of fun covering terrain here. But we went from Heidi to maybe say common law and how we come up with our laws. Now we're coming up with how our civil society itself, and particularly our civil rulers, are going to be ordered. So speak briefly to establishment. What is this establishment that you're talking about? What is it? What is it not? And can you get the common law thing without some kind of establishment?
Yeah, so first I'll say it's very interesting that, there's a lot of, so much ink is spilled on the founding era, and almost none of it's good. Very little of it's any good. But we love to talk about it, and there's always, especially at a popular level, people writing about this. And one thing you often hear is, in tandem usually with the sort of godless constitution argument, is that, people like Jefferson, who are appealing to the natural order and to reason and these things, indicates that they're therefore unchristian, let's just say socially and in their thought. They're out of a Christian frame. They are this some kind of mythical thing called a deist, which doesn't seem to have really existed with most of the founders. There is a definition for it, but they're a very bad deist if they were. But it's an indication that we're a secular nation, because they're not appealing to God by name. It's got to be something else. Now we've arrived at a point where if you appeal to the things that Jefferson would have appealed to, it's an indication that you're a Christian, which is actually true. So they're actually correct in what they've come around to seeing it the appropriate way, and probably are going to increasingly abandon any appeals to the founding as a matter of tradition, right? Because it's going to undercut them. But to the question of establishment, as I like to say in property law, there's this analogy used that property rights is like a bundle of sticks. It's not one thing, but you can have a few sticks, you can have a whole bunch of sticks. You can kind of break it up and think about it that way. Concerning the amount of control you have, right? If you're a renter, you have less sticks in your bundle than if you're the owner of the property renting it. Establishment in some ways can be thought of in the same through the same analogy, that there are various modes of establishment. It's not one thing, and the mode that you have should be conducive to the history and tradition and culture of the people. So as I will often talk about, if you set yourself in 18th century America, there's a certain political liberality that you can enjoy with one another because so much is assumed and agreed upon. There's so much homogeneity. You're not only just 98% British, but you're almost all Protestants, right? There's 2,000 Jews and a few 100,000 Catholics or something like this. Only 3 million people. So you're all Protestant, some strand of it, and you all come from share the same language, same basic historical background and ancestry. These things you can assume a lot. You don't have to have as heavy a hand in your dealings with one another. It's as homogeneity breaks down that you have to have more mechanisms of sort of perpetuating or fostering that homogeneity that's always underlying, whatever your government structure is. It's the real people and the real nation, not just the constitutional order. So establishment can look a lot like what we had in various states. We've talked about this before at the founding, where you have certain privileges for Protestants, you have certain tax support for Protestant churches and public teachers and these things. And then you condemn, generally anti-Christian behavior, both vices and, open heresy or blasphemy as just being, it's not conducive to stable social order. It's bad because this is what we all are. And it's also, of course, doing justice to the one who's granted authority to government anyway. So that, that's what I would call a particularly soft establishment, where you have a lot of diversity at the state level within this general confederacy. And whereas you might look at a different model, such as in 17th century England, where you have a monarch who is temporally speaking head of the church, has a lot more influence and authority on the things around the church, its mode of operation, even if he's not teaching the doctrine or administering the sacraments, he is dictating the form of the church in many ways and how it's going to govern itself. And that would be a stricter establishment, right? So there's leeway on this according to prudence, what you're, even according to geography and the way you've kind of settled yourselves, that you should be sensitive to as a good ruler. So there's various modes of establishment, but the thing that unites them is this public recognition of Christianity, and in some sense, its privileging of Christianity and its punishment of violations of certain public, affronts to Christianity, and then it's also its disfavoring of non-Christians. It doesn't, the tolerance only makes sense. It doesn't make sense in a pluralistic vein. It only makes sense when there is some kind of establishment that is, not generally pagan, where you have a multiplicity of deities that's allowable. So tolerance is something you can show to dissenters, and they'll always be present, but there's no requirement that you need to favor them or give them equal sort of civil participation or representation as the Christians. And we always and everywhere do this in some regard. It's just a question of whether it's Christian or not.
While the stricter form of this establishment is certainly could also be called the not going to wash up on these shores form of establishment.
Okay.
The softer, the softer form.
Yeah.
I'm interested. I have two questions. One, give us the minimum that would have to happen in order to go, that's a soft establishment. And second, for the people that think it's just totally crazy, go to town on colonial America and just show how widespread it was in our own very recent history.
Yeah, and we should think of it as recent history. I mean, we're a super young country. It's not that long ago, right? So, and the vestiges of the establishment of Christian establishment in a coherent sense, were only recently disrupted. As I mentioned, the blasphemy and Sabbath laws endured for a long time into the 20th century. There's still like localities that have restrictions on the Sabbath of economic, activity. In any case, the early America, you have this kind of thing everywhere. I mean, 9 of the states have very explicit, requirements for civil office. Most places have restrictions on, there's no atheist on juries. There's no way to hold them accountable. They're not truthful. They don't recognize a higher law. So we'd probably just have to ban juries today because there's no one to serve on them. But you have these kinds of open, legally codified privileges of Christians, not just in a gratuitous sense, but with the recognition that these are the people that will contribute to social life in a way that's congruent with their peers, and also that's objectively good, right? So we want to make sure they're the ones that are in charge, essentially. And then you also want to make it easy for Christians to do Christian things. I mean, that's the main rationale given by courts for Sabbath laws. It is in our tradition, it is historical, but the main thing is we don't want Christians economically on Sundays to be overcome by non-Christians just because they want to worship the Lord, right? That's not a choice they should have to make. We want to make it very easy for and make it clear to everyone which Sabbath we're in favor of. That's the religion we want to be perpetuated. So that's just all over the place. You don't even have to get into the demographics per se, although as I already said, was overwhelmingly Protestant, or even the particular convictions of our elite kind of founders, the ones Washington onwards that actually do things. But they're all operating within a Christian frame, and most of them actually are convictionally Christian. So that's just there. I mean, it's just part of our history. So in any sense that you want to have congruence with that, you need to find ways to perpetuate it in the way that they did, and for the reasons that they did, not in a bare positivist sense that, well, first in time kind of deal, they got there first, just happens to be Christian, I guess that's what we got to do. But think of it the way that they would also as you address new challenges and states of affairs. You had one more question, and I forget what it was now.
Well, I think you covered them both. It was,
Okay.
it was what would be the bare minimum, and you kind of indicated Sabbath laws and certain customs.
I think,
such.
yeah, bare minimum, I think, I say two quick things here. One, I think it's especially important to do it with your civil authority and rulers, right? To make the standard clear for what you want out of them. You can do that in various ways, but the test for office is like the easiest one. The other thing I'd say is go back to my comment where I said the structure is basically fine. We do live in an establishment. Everything signals what that establishment is. Your public displays that are government funded and accepted and not allowed to be torn down on pain of death or at least jailing. Your public school curriculum is a good indication of what the establishment is. We all know what that's like and has been like. Maybe some people are changing it in certain localities, but in general, it's very obvious what doctrines are being pushed on your children. That's a very good indication of what the reigning religion is, because it's raising the citizens that you want, right? So these kinds of things are ones that if your public school curriculum expressed Christianity, that's a good sign of what the establishment is. So those kinds of things, which are very soft, no one has a gun pointed to their head. But they're indicating what we value in society, and that's all administered and expressed through law.
So, last question. You have maybe 2-3 minutes to answer it. When you're in the world of ideas and kind of the Reformation that's happening on the ideological level, which will need to be implemented politically and practically. But there's just so many places you could go for things that need to be restructured that we would hit this particular goal we're after. Call it Christian nationalism, call it mere Christendom, call it a Christian nation, Christian state, whatever. Restructuring of the new sexual constitution that Scott Yenner, an acquaintance of ours, was just talking about, educational reform, the common law, the role of judges and duties and what they must be, and we could list out several other options. Which one do you think is the most important that you would call like thinkers that are on board say we need to develop this particular idea and doctrine, recover this so that we would see it implemented? Which one do you think is most important?
Yeah. So on the practical level, where should we strike first, or where should we consolidate our interest? I think the intuition that a lot of people have, and I'm saying this because it seems to be what's woken a lot of people up, is school curriculum. I just think that is, and it's rightly so, because you recognize it's where, school is indoctrination. It's not this kind of pursuit of bare education or some kind of neutral plane is a fool's errand. It's indoctrinating them into something, and that's what it's supposed to do. And it's something that people in the founding recognized. I always cite Benjamin Rush on this, where he's just like, in a classical Republican vein, which says less about the structure of your government, more about the character and nature of it, indoctrinating your children to be the types of citizens you want is paramount. If you stop doing that, it's over. So he wanted to. He had very aggressive kind of plans for this. So I would say that it's intuitively recognized by people that maybe not even adopting the label and don't really know why, but it's bothersome to them. And I would say that's the correct instinct. Go further. It's not just to get trans out. It's not just to get DEI out. You need to present. In some senses, that's debating them on their own terms in kind of this liberal plane is self-defeating. It's designed for you to lose. You need to assert your positive vision for what you want that to be, because you're thereby dictating the future nature and character of your commonwealth, of your polity. So I would say that's a great place to start. And the fact that it's so explosive indicates that the other side recognizes that as well.
Yeah, boy, there's all different areas to go there on a practical level. Obviously, ACCS, Association of Classical Christian Schools, just kind of a revitalization of K through 12 classical Christian education would be a place to start. You're going to have to figure out all that has to be done with the government education. Obviously, it's a thing. What are you going to do with it, and how are you going to reform it, and all of that? So many different, maybe a conversation for next time where we could go with pushing it all into the corners.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have lots of ideas about the role education is supposed to, what it's supposed to do and what it does do in our country. But one thing I just add on that too, on the sort of classical education debate, is something I was talking with Nathan Gill about. He had written a piece for us, and we also not only need to just have Christian and classical, we have to figure out what that means, and it needs to be connected to where you are. It needs to be an American Christian and classical education. It needs to be put people in touch with their people and tradition and their nation. And that's different, again, than just the geographic boundaries you occupy. There's a particular nation that the government's supposed to serve, and it has to pick one that the order is constructed around. And so you need to promote that. You need to revive your own heroes again, and you need to promote those as the model for what you want people to be. And that's just as important as getting the facts down or trying to exercise your intellectual muscles. It needs to be aspirational.
Timon, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, man.
It's been great to see you again.
Appreciate you.